was 29 when a man with a precise smile offered me a future packaged like a contract. My name is Emily, and before that night my life had been measured in shifts, bus fares, and the slow cough of my mother that reminded me time cost money. I had learned to keep my head down, to fold my pride into the corners of a battered bag, to make smallness into a daily habit. Being invisible was not an accident for me. It had become a skill for survival. Nathan Parker's offer arrived like thunder in a calm sky. He proposed a marriage of convenience, 3 months of shared names in exchange for $1 million, a room in a mansion, and the promise that at the end, we would walk away to our separate lives. When he presented the leather folder and the inked clauses, he did so with the lightness of a man who trades in people as currency. I signed because I had no other path. The money meant a chance to breathe, to lift my mother from the edge, and to imagine a life that did not begin and end with other people's needs. The courthouse was sterile and fast. No vows, no witness of friends, just a clerk and a pen. Nathan guided me after with the same practiced precision he used on his boardroom table, the polite hand at the small of my back, the measured step. The mansion smelled of lemon polish and old money. Staff addressed me with a polite distance that taught me how to be still. I learned posture and practiced smiles that did not reach my eyes, and the house taught me how to be seen as spectacle rather than a person. I tried to convince myself that learning the performance would smooth the bargain's edges, that appearing small might keep me safe. Then I found the paper. It was a printout, tucked in the back of a drawer, a conversation in black and white that reduced my life to a wager. In one column were numbers, in another casual mentions of my name like an item in inventory. The ledger and the messages stripped away any faint hope that what I had was accidental. It was deliberate, callous, planned. Shame settled into a new shape. It became a tool rather than a chain. I began collecting receipts, transfers, names that linked men to shell companies. I learned the rhythms of the house, when certain doors unlocked, which staff left reports unattended, which meetings wandered long enough for me to borrow a glance at an open file. I hid copies in places no one looked: inside a shampoo bottle, beneath an old tile in a storeroom, tucked into the hem of a curtain. Each paper was a quiet promise that I was not finished being more than they had paid for. Small allies appeared where I least expected them. A junior accountant left me a list of suspicious transfers on a night shift. A housemaid slipped me a folded note telling me when the study would be empty. They didn't expect heroism. They offered what they could: information. I turned those scraps into a map. When I planned the reveal, I thought of it like an operation. The gala Nathan hosted was perfect: cameras, journalists, investors, a room that would not allow whispers to stay private. I wore the gown he had chosen as camouflage. Under its silk, I held a small flash drive that felt heavier than any jewel. The projector hummed. The speech began. I stepped forward to adjust the microphone. The screen filled with ledgers, with emails, with transfers labeled as charity, that led to places with no real address. As names lit up in the room reeled, I spoke. Not loudly, there was power and calm, but with a clarity that left no room for the polite denials they practiced. Men who'd treated dignity like a negotiable asset sat like children caught with hands in a cookie jar. Phones recorded, cameras captured, and the orchestration of their comfortable lives unraveled in real time. I left the hall while chaos took its course, feeling the strange double of fear and release. The bargain had been broken, and I would never be small again. The days after the gala felt like living inside a storm I had summoned and could not control. Cameras hunted the sidewalks like scavengers. Reporters called with the breathless hunger of people hungry for collapse. Nathan's face turned from composed to furious, to carefully wounded, as he practiced indignation for television. Lawyers slid into view with soft shoes and sharper tongues. I had thought that once the truth was out, it would be simple, that darkness exposed would wither. Instead, exposure invited retaliation. Power knows how to claw for survival. Investigators came earnest and slow, their questions precise. I handed over the copies I'd hidden in a dozen places: shampoo bottles, hollow tiles, the seam of an old coat, watching them catalog each scrap, like a careful priest. When I read the look on their faces, I felt both vindicated and suddenly very small. The papers were not only my vindication, they were instruments now in a machine louder than me. With each signature, the men were forced to explain. Another part of the house of cards trembled. I slept badly, if at all, my dreams populated by ledgers and the clicking of heels on marble, but the thing that unmoored me most was the way my past began to creep toward the surface. A woman, one of the older housekeepers who had been around longer than the rest, found me in the laundry room one morning and pressed a folded photo into my hand. It was yellowed at the edges, a portrait of a younger woman with my mother's eyes standing in that very mansion decades ago, beside a man with the same jawline as Nathan's father. The housekeeper's voice was a small thing. She worked here once, she said. They kept her quiet with money. The paper was a seed whose roots reached down into the same soil I dug through for evidence. I carried that photo like contraband at first, then like an accusation. When I brought it home, my mother's face shifted into a terrain I had not mapped. She was small in the chair, her hands trembling around a mug that had long cooled. I had made a life out of not asking the heavy questions, because the answers often come wrapped in pain. But the photograph pulled the lid off months of silence. At first she said nothing. The lines at the corners of her mouth deepened until they looked like fault lines. Then slowly, she told me a story that broke the places inside me I had only recently mended. She had been young and hungry, my mother said, 30 years ago. The mansion had been a place of jobs and cold tea and promises. A man in power had offered money for silence after a night that had gone wrong. He had promised help, said he would make sure she and a child would be safe. My mother had accepted, because safety wears many faces, and pride can be a luxury without a roof over your head. The money paid for a room, for medicine for me. She had kept her silence because survival is sometimes a bargain made with the worst of the world. When I asked why, she'd never told me, her eyes filled, and she whispered, I wanted to shield you from the ugliness. I thought I could protect you by burying it. Hearing that was like discovering a second betrayal folded into the first. My fury flickered, then shifted into something complicated and raw. She had been compromised, yes, but not complicit in the way I'd once thought. She had been a mother trying to navigate a world that offered few options. The ledger that had sold me into a marriage was not merely corporate cruelty. It was part of a culture where survival had been commodified for generations. My mother's silence was both a wound and a shield. That revelation did not soften my resolve. If anything, it sharpened it. Understanding the path that led us there gave context to the motives of others, of the men who smoothed their consciences with cash, of families who bartered daughters for security, of institutions that turned human lives into fiscal entries. The fight was no longer a single act of personal vindication. It had become a dismantling of a pattern that had chewed through lives for decades. My rage widened into a public purpose, but revelation also brought threats that were no longer abstract. Anonymous letters began to return, more violent now that the stakes were visible. Someone left a warning on my doorstep one night. No signature, just a small envelope with a single line inside. You will regret this. Fear arrived in new forms. People who used to nod in the stairwell now averted their eyes. A truck idled too long across the street one evening, and its driver watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I learned to be careful in new ways, turning routines into routes designed to throw off anyone following me. I slept with the light on for a week. Then I learned to sleep again with practice, and with the knowledge that courage is often stitched together from tiny repeated acts. Allies multiplied in quieter places. The junior accountant who had slipped me bank references called and said he had found more. A former receptionist sent a photograph of an envelope that had once been left behind, the handwriting a clue we had overlooked. Survivors from other houses began to email anonymous notes of solidarity. They didn't all want name or fame. They wanted their truths acknowledged. Their stories filled in the blank spaces my papers couldn't name, and together they made a chorus impossible to dismiss. Still, in the nights between the calls and the meetings, I felt the old ache, the question of what I had sacrificed to become visible. I had stolen, yes, and I had lied to myself and others to gather proof. The moral lines blurred under the pressure of survival and the promise of justice. I reminded myself that the men who had bought silence had been operating under a calculus that stripped other people of choice. My own methods were messy. The world is messy. But I clung to one certainty: hiding the truth had never protected anyone for long. When the investigators finally called to say they were ready to move forward with warrants, I felt a fierce relief that displaced my exhaustion. The papers would not only end careers, they would force institutions to account. The public would see not just a scandal, but a pattern. And somewhere in that unspooling, my mother could breathe differently, and perhaps other whispered lives could start to speak without trembling. I had wanted to be free of smallness. I had wanted my mother to breathe without debt's weight. As the machinery turned and subpoenas flew like birds startled into the sky, I understood that freedom is not a destination, but a constant act of choosing. Choosing to stand when standing means you might fall. There was still much to lose, but for the first time, I had something of my own to protect, a truth I no longer needed to carry alone. When the subpoenas started to fly, the world shifted under my feet in a different way, less like an earthquake, and more like the slow collapse of a rotten staircase. Men in suits I'd never met arrived at my apartment with polite manners and gravel voices asking for dates, times, copies of files, the locations of the shampoo bottle and the tile. Each question was a pull, a test, to see how much I could bear to give. I handed over what I had, because the paper was never mine to hoard. It belonged to the women whose names had never been printed, to the clerks who had been told to look the other way. Even as the investigators catalogued my scraps, I felt a tidal swell of shame and relief. Shame, because I had been the one to hide truth in hollow places. Relief, because hiding would no longer be my future. Nathan's response was classic theater indignation, practiced into a script. He held a press conference in which his jaw worked like a metronome, and his voice quoted Charity Legacy, and the pain of lies told about him. The media ate it up at first. Power knows how to buy silence and purchase sympathy. But there were cracks. My mother watched the broadcasts with a face that had learned to read nuance like scripture. When she saw the ledger I had found printed on the morning news, her hands trembled in a new way, less from fear and more from a relief that felt like atonement. People who had once nodded at me in the corridor began to avoid the coffee shop near my building, because cameras and microphones had moved from the gala to the sidewalks. The threats escalated from anonymous notes to targeted pressure. Someone keyed my apartment door late one night, carving a sliver of menace into paint. My mail was rifled through and left askew. A man in a black sedan watched me from across the street for days. Once a bouquet arrived with no card but with a note tucked into the tissue. "We know where your mother shops." Fear arrived with an intimacy that felt obscene, designed to make the private parts of my life unsafe. I learned to walk different routes, to keep lights on, to let my mother sleep at a friend's house sometimes, because she deserved peace, even if I did not. Yet with that pressure came a swell of solidarity I had not expected. Survivors began to reach out, emails, small anonymous envelopes left at my door, trembling phone calls at midnight. They told me things that the papers couldn't. The way a certain executive always asked the new hires to stay late alone the night a junior manager disappeared from the staff list and never returned, the whispered apologies from a woman who had once been offered hush money. Their voices knitted into a chorus that made my single drive with a flash drive feel less like a fluke and more like the beginning of a tide. An online forum sprung up where people traded tips on safety and legal resources. They called me a name I had never expected: catalyst. Calling me that made me want to laugh and cry at once. The junior accountant who had handed me the bank references came under scrutiny. He was questioned for hours, and then escorted to a separate room where I couldn't see him. I feared at first that we had lost an ally, that fear or bribery had turned him cold. Later he appeared in court to testify, not broken, not silent, but steady. He had been scared straight into courage. He told the judge about transfers that had once been margin notes, and the names that had been footnotes. When he spoke, the room leaned in like a congregation listening for the name of a sin finally being spoken aloud. There were setbacks. The defense launched a smear campaign, photos of me in the company corridors taken out of context, insinuations that I had motives unrelated to justice, stories rewritten, so I looked like an opportunist rather than a witness. Old shame, the one I had tried to be done with, resurfaced in headlines that liked sensationalism more than nuance. I spent nights composing responses and then deleting them, fearful of becoming part of the theater Nathan's lawyers wanted. My mother would wake to find me at the kitchen table, a torn notebook of notes and countless drafts, and she would lay a hand on mine like a benediction and say, "You did the right thing." Her voice was my most radical support. As the legal machinery revved up, I was called to appear before a judge to lay the evidence bare. The courthouse smelled like lemon cleaner and human impatience. The moment I stepped into the witness room, I felt the old costume of smallness tempting me like an old friend. It wanted me to shrink. I did not. I spoke about ledgers and shell companies. I spoke about the smell of old polish, and the way laughter had sounded in the rooms where they traded human dignity for contracts. I talked about my mother and the photograph that had rewritten our family's silence. The words felt heavy at first, and then lighter as they left me. Each sentence was not just testimony, but reclamation. Outside the courthouse, picketers held signs with words I didn't expect. "We see you." No more silence. Women I did not know hugged me in the street. A young reporter, her notebook still warm from the press room, asked me how I had found the courage. I wanted to tell her that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to feel it anyway. Instead, I said simply, I remembered who I wanted my daughter to be if I had one someday, and I chose that woman. Dangerous moments still threaded through the days. A car clipped the curb outside me one afternoon in a way that looked accidental, until a man stepped out and stood too close, then walked away without making a scene. My allies started wearing my face in private groups, screenshots, notes, photographic evidence of patterns. That work, tedious and relentless, built toward the point where the institutions that had wrapped themselves around Nathan's empire could not plausibly ignore the breadth of the wrongdoing. By the time indictments were announced, I felt unmoored and strangely centered at once. The indictments named names and crimes with an exactness that felt like a scalpel. The legal calendar filled with hearings, and every day felt like a steep hill that we climbed a little further up. There were moments of despair, phone calls that made my hands shake, whispers of settlements that could buy silence again. But then someone's grandmother would email me to say her granddaughter no longer accepted late-night shifts alone, and the fatigue would lift like fog. I had never imagined my small act would ripple into so many lives. It terrified me and steadied me in equal measure. Now, as we edged closer to the public hearings that would make or break the accountability we sought, I found myself holding a new kind of breath, not the one that counted days of fear, but the one that filled lungs before a plunge. There would be testimonies, cameras, men who would try to reclaim narratives. There would be more danger, certainly. But there would also be a chance for the truth to land with force in a world that had tolerated sharp bargains for too long. The first public hearing felt like stepping onto ice that might give way beneath me. The courthouse had been swarmed by cameras. The room smelled of coffee and the metallic tension of law. I sat in a hard chair surrounded by counsel who spoke in legal shorthand, their faces a blur of calm urgency. When the bailiff called my name, my hands tightened around the file I carried, the same file whose fragments had once lived in shampoo bottles and behind broken tiles. Walking to the stand, I felt every small thing I'd ever been pushed to forget press into me, the long hours, the way men brushed past without names, my mother's soft apologies. But there was also the ledger's quiet steadiness in my pocket, the proof I had sewn into places no one would think to look. I thought of all the other women who had not had a voice in this world, and how their hushed truths now rode on my back. Cross-examination is a striptease of memory. They pulled at the edges of my past, asking for dates, for motives, for tiny slips that could be turned into scandal. I answered in plain sentences, not to win favor, but to make the record clean. There were moments when the defense tried to paint me as opportunistic, a dramatic preserver of self, rather than a witness with ruined years to prove a pattern. I thought of how newspapers had already tried to make me a villain or a spectacle, and I let those strategies wash over me like wind. When I spoke about the hidden transfers, about the accounts that led to islands and fake charities, I did it without hatred in my voice, but with an insistence that made the room lean in. Every signature I read aloud was a small unmaking of the world that had made commodity of people like me. The hearings produced a cascade of things I had only half imagined. Some of the men who had once been shields for the wealthy began to unravel in private rooms. A mid-level executive who had once smirked in elevators when I passed came forward and confessed to funneling money to a charity that did not exist. The junior accountant, the quiet, frightened man who'd slipped me bank references, testified under subpoena with a steadiness that made my throat ache. He spoke of pressure and threats, and of the small human shame of doing nothing because it was easier than speaking. When his words hit the transcripts, I felt a tenderness for his fear. Courage is contagious in odd ways. Then came the thing no one had planned for a witness with a past I had only partly suspected. The older housekeeper who had given me the photograph stood in the well and told a story about a woman who had worked here years ago, who had been paid to be quiet after a night that left her vulnerable. Her voice trembled, but it carried. She named dates, she named a manager long gone, she named a hush payment tucked into an envelope no one had thought to catalog. The room, so used to polished statements and legalese, shifted. What had felt like an isolated ledger now looked like part of an older architecture of buying silence. My mother's story, once a private ache, was now a legal arrow pointing toward institutional rot. That revelation widened the case from corporate corruption into something older and more corrosive. A culture that had turned vulnerability into commerce, survival into bargaining. It tied the ledger to the photograph, the hush money to a lineage of protectors who had long fortified the mansion's reputation. The prosecution, who had until then been careful and methodical, took the new threads and wove them through their narrative, with the precision of someone unrolling a tapestry that hid unspeakable patterns. I watched, oddly removed and present, as investigators connected shell companies to foundations, and foundations to people who had smiled at me in lobbies. The dizzying thing was how quickly private shame became public accountability when the right documents met the right witness. There were low moments too, an anonymous envelope left on my stoop with a grainy photo of my mother grocery shopping and a single sentence on a scrap of paper. "We can follow you." A car that idled too long outside my building. A neighbor who'd once waved now tightened his curtains whenever I passed. Those intimations of danger could have been enough to make the bravest person bow out, but the steady stream of support that followed was louder than the threats. Strangers left notes under my door, survivors' networks offered safe houses if needed, and a community of lawyers worked pro bono, because as one young attorney told me privately, "Some cases change how people think." That phrase lodged under my ribs like a small steady flame, as the calendar filled with hearings and the press spun narratives of scandal and sensation. A more private confrontation arrived. Nathan's father, an older man with the same lined jaw as his son, requested a meeting through counsel. I agreed because avoidance felt cowardly now. He arrived with a man's politeness that smelled faintly of cologne and old regrets. He did not apologize in the way the movies show. He was too practiced in the currency of understatement for that. Instead, he spoke of mistakes made by people in desperate times, and of how money had been used as a quietifier for too long. When he mentioned a name that matched the photograph, an old knot inside me both tightened and began to unbind. He offered no absolution. What he offered, clumsily and humanly, was recognition, a small dangerous thing that still mattered. I left the room more certain than before that the fight was no longer merely about my smallness or his empire. It was about who got to set rules of dignity in a world that had traded it away for comfort. The hearings would continue, as would the press, and the threats, and the small kindnesses that lit my days. But standing at that strange crossroads where exposure met law, and where a mother's buried pain became a public ledger, I felt something settle into me that no ledger could subtract, an understanding that truth once set loose has its own stubborn gravity. I had not become a hero by choice, I had become one by necessity. And necessity has a way of asking you again and again to be braver than you thought you could be. The weeks after the hearings folded into months each day, a small negotiation between fear and forward motion. Some men struck plea deals admitting to transactions that had once been whispered about over expensive lunches. Others fought until their coffers emptied, and their reputations could no longer be used as currency. When a conviction finally came for one of the senior executives, the newsroom that had once reduced me to a thumbnail ran a longer piece that named the pattern rather than the spectacle. The courthouse steps filled with people clutching signs, and a woman I had never met pressed a hand into mine without fanfare and said, "Thank you." That moment, human and soft, felt like the real verdict. Justice in law is one thing, but justice in the daily life of a city is another, quieter, slower, and made from the tiny choices people make afterward. What surprised me most was how the unmaking of their empire changed ordinary things. HR departments rewritten policies, charities that had been fronts found themselves audited, and the mansion that once hummed with secret bargains instituted trainings and open forums, as if ritual could stitch back the trust they had shredded. Some of that felt staged. Some of it felt necessary. The juniors who had been too frightened to speak before now walked with straighter shoulders. The junior accountant who had once slipped me a folded list now had a job that kept him safe, and to my quiet satisfaction, he passed me on the street with a nod that said, "Without words, we did it." My mother and I rebuilt in small increments. We moved into a brighter apartment, one with a window that caught the sun in the morning. She made tea with an attentiveness that seemed like penance at first, but it grew into ritual. 2 cups, 2 spoons, laughter that crept back like spring after a long winter. We spoke of the past in fragments, in places where grief did not coagulate into silence. Sometimes she cried, and sometimes I did, and sometimes we simply sat with the dull hum of a radio, and the kind of companionable silence that felt earned. I forgave her, not because she deserved a clean slate, but because forgiveness untangled us both from the heavy knot of secrecy. Forgiveness for me was a practice, not an absolution. It was a way to lay down part of the weight so we could both move. People asked if I felt vindicated. I would say yes, and then pause because the feeling was complicated. There was vindication in the public record, certainly, and there was relief in seeing the men who had bought silence held to some account. But there was also a cost that did not show up in headlines. The friendships that frayed under pressure, the nights I woke to the sound of tires outside, the small rituals I'd lost to focus and fear. My life after the gala was not a cinematic ascent. It was a slow, uneven reclamation of the right to be ordinary. I applied for a teaching job at the community college I had once dreamed of, and the day I stepped into that first classroom, I felt the old learning curiosity buzz in my chest like a small lamp. Students asked tough questions and sometimes told me pieces of their lives, and once a young woman told me she had taken my case as permission to speak up at work. Those were the moments that fixed things back together. The legal victories did not erase the culture that had enabled the crimes. They cracked an edifice and made the work of repair visible. It felt right that survivors and activists began to organize around policy changes, clearer whistleblower protections, safer reporting channels, and legal aid funds for those who could not afford representation. I spoke at a few of those panels, my voice hoarse the first time and steadier later. I said what I had learned the hard way, that courage is rarely a single act, and that systems are built to protect the comfortable unless enough of us decide they shouldn't. People nodded. People took notes. People made calls. There were awkward moments too when private human failing showed through the legal armor. Nathan's face in interviews sometimes looked haunted in a way that made me briefly pity him, and then I would remember the ledger and the nights I had spent counting the cost of silence. Compassion and accountability are not opposites. They can coexist, messy and necessary. I let that complexity live in me without letting it dilute why I had stood up in the first place. Months later, I walked past the old mansion on an errand and saw new faces there. Young staff who did not know the stories yet. People who would learn different habits because the air had changed. I felt a small, fierce pride that the space where I had once been invisible now had cracks of light in its corners. My name was not printed on a plaque, and I did not crave that. What I wanted, what I worked for, was a world where quiet people did not have to become loud to be heard. If you have listened to this story and it has touched you, know, this silence can be survival, but it can also be a slow kind of death. Truth is heavy, and it can feel like a weapon, but it can also be a lifeline. If you are carrying something that gnaws at you, consider whether telling it to the right person might be the start of something that outlives fear. Gather allies, be patient, and protect yourself. Courage is practical. It is planning and small acts and trusted confidants, as much as it is a single brave headline moment. If my story moved you, please help more voices be heard like this video, share it with someone who might need to see it, and subscribe if you want to follow more stories about people who found their courage in unlikely places. Leave a comment below if you've ever felt invisible or found a way to speak up. Your words might be the map someone else needs. Thank you for staying with me through this.